The world was a biting monochrome. Snow, thin and sharp, whipped horizontally across the desolate woods, stinging Alara's exposed skin. She hadn't known cold could feel like this, not merely an absence of warmth, but an active, malicious entity seeking to strip her bare, bone by bone. Her cloak, threadbare and soaked, offered little defense against the wind that roared through the skeletal trees. Each breath was a shallow, painful gasp, the air burning in her lungs. Her feet, wrapped in rags inside worn boots, were numb lumps of ice, threatening to give way with every uneven step. She stumbled over a root hidden beneath a dusting of snow, collapsing onto her hands and knees. The impact jolted through her, sending a wave of pain up her arms, but it was a dull throb compared to the pervasive ache of cold and terror. Tears, frozen on her cheeks, were just another layer of ice. She couldn't cry, not properly. The energy required was too great, the moisture too precious. Panic, a cold, hard stone, sat heavy in her gut. Abandoned, utterly, irrevocably alone. The faces of the men who had left her flashed behind her eyes, sneering, indifferent. The wagon tracks had vanished hours ago under the relentless wind, leaving her marooned in this white and gray purgatory. Death felt impossibly close, a silent presence stalking her through the trees. She pushed herself up, her limbs protesting, forcing her leaden feet forward. Survival wasn't a hope, merely an instinct, a desperate, animal refusal to lie down and accept the end. It was the faint scent of wood smoke that caught her attention first, a fragile thread of warmth in the frigid air. Hope, sharp and dangerous, pierced through her despair. She changed direction, following the scent, stumbling through brush and snowdrifts. The woods seemed to stretch infinitely, the promise of smoke receding and returning like a cruel mirage. Just as her legs screamed their final protest, she saw it, a cabin, low and weathered, nestled in a small clearing. Smoke curled lazily from a stone chimney, a beacon in the storm. Fear warred with desperation. People, could they be worse than the cold? Her recent experience warned caution, screamed danger. But the alternative was certain death. Shivering uncontrollably, her teeth chattering so violently she couldn't speak, she dragged herself towards the cabin. Her knuckles scraped against the rough wood door as she raised a trembling hand to knock, a sound impossibly loud in the roaring silence of the wind. The sound died. She couldn't knock. Her strength gave out. She slid down the door frame, a heap of frozen misery, pressing her ear against the wood, listening. Silence. Then the slow, deliberate sound of a bolt sliding back. The door creaked open. He stood silhouetted against the dim light within. Tall, broad-shouldered, his face obscured by shadow and a thick beard. His eyes, when they focused on her huddled form, were unreadable, neither kind nor cruel, just watchful. He held a rifle loosely in one hand. Alara couldn't find her voice. She could only offer a silent plea with her eyes, a raw, vulnerable appeal that laid bare her complete destitution. The wind howled, pushing her further into the doorway. He didn't move, didn't speak, just studied her. The moment stretched, taut with unspoken judgment. This was it. Her fate rested on the silent decision of this stranger. His gaze lingered, assessing, perhaps weighing the trouble she represented against some unseen code. Finally, slowly, he lowered the rifle. He stepped back, opening the door wider, a silent, reluctant invitation. The smell of pine and smoke and something else, animal hides, wood shavings, spilled out, promising warmth, promising life. With a final, shuddering gasp, Alara crawled across the threshold, collapsing onto the floor. The cold would floor a sudden luxury compared to the biting snow outside. She was inside. She was, for this moment, alive. The door closed behind her with a soft thud, shutting out the storm, sealing her in with the silent man and the unknown future. The cabin was small, Spartan, filled with the muted glow of a single oil lamp and the crackle of the fire in the hearth. Alara lay where she had fallen, shivering, her eyes tracking the man as he moved. Silas. She'd heard him murmur it to himself as he knelt briefly beside her. checking if she was truly just cold, not injured. Silas didn't offer effusive comfort, nor did he ask questions. He simply moved with quiet efficiency. He nudged a worn blanket towards her with his foot. She fumbled with frozen fingers, eventually managing to pull the rough wool over herself. The immediate, searing pain of returning warmth began in her extremities. 1,000 needles pricking her skin, agony that felt, paradoxically, like salvation. He stoked the fire, added another log, the sparks dancing upwards. Then he busied himself at a small table, preparing something that smelled faintly of broth. He placed a rough-hewn bowl on the floor near her head, along with a tin cup of water. He still hadn't spoken directly to her, his presence a quiet, grounding force in the small space. Alara pushed herself up, leaning weakly against the wall. Her hands trembled as she lifted the bowl. The broth was simple, thin, but impossibly rich and nourishing. Each spoonful was a tiny victory against the cold that still clung to her. She ate slowly, savoring the heat, the simple goodness of it. Silas sat across the room, mending a leather strap, his focus absolute. He didn't watch her constantly, but she felt his awareness, a quiet presence that was neither threatening nor overtly welcoming. It was simply there. Over the next few days, the silence between them became a language of its own. Alara began to recover, the initial shock and cold receding. She moved stiffly at first, her muscles aching, but the simple act of surviving, of being sheltered and fed, felt like a profound luxury. Silas continued his routine, tending to the fire, chopping wood, checking traps outside, preparing simple meals. He spoke only when necessary, short, clipped sentences about practical matters. Would water eat? He never asked about her past, her name, how she came to be abandoned in the woods. And she didn't offer. The silence was safe. It allowed her to exist without judgment, without the need to explain the shame and fear that still coiled in her gut. She began to help, tentatively at first, gathering fallen branches for kindling, sweeping the dirt floor with a bundle of pine needles, washing the few dishes in heated water. Silas watched her, his gaze steady and assessing. She expected him to tell her to stop, to assert that this was his space, his work. But he said nothing, merely accepting her small contributions with a silent nod. In his silence, she found a strange kind of acceptance. He saw her, not as the failure who had been cast out, but simply as another being needing shelter from the storm. This quiet acceptance began to chip away at the layers of fear and shame. She started to observe him more closely, the careful way he sharpened his knife, the strength in his hands as he split logs, the faraway look in his eyes sometimes when he stared into the fire. He was an enigma, but not a frightening one. His silence was not emptiness, but contained reserve. She still didn't know why he had helped her, this solitary man of the woods, but his presence, quiet and steadfast, was slowly replacing the cold stone of panic in her gut with a fragile seed of something else, perhaps, just perhaps, trust. As the snow outside continued its relentless fall, blanketing the world in white and deepening the isolation, a tentative rhythm settled into the small cabin. Alara, her strength slowly returning, found purpose in the simple, repetitive tasks of survival. She learned to distinguish the sound of Silas's footsteps on the snow, the particular whistle he made when he was checking the traps furthest from the cabin, the low murmur he sometimes directed at the fire. He remained a man of few words, but his actions began to speak louder than any dialogue. He always ensured she had a place by the fire, that her bowl was filled, that her worn boots were drying near the hearth. These were not grand gestures, but in their consistency, they built a bridge across the chasm of silence and suspicion. Alara watched him work, fascinated by his self-sufficiency, the quiet competence with which he navigated the harsh environment. He seemed a part of the woods, as natural and enduring as the ancient pines surrounding the cabin. She started to talk, softly at first, mostly to herself as she worked, narrating her tasks, gathering wood. Washing dishes Silas never interrupted, but sometimes she would catch his eye, a brief moment of shared awareness before he returned to his task. One evening, as a fierce gust of wind rattled the cabin walls, she flinched. Silas looked up from sharpening his axe. "Storm," he said, his voice a low rumble. It was the most he had spoken at once in days. Cabin Hold's his gaze held hers for a beat longer than usual, a simple statement of fact that carried an unspoken reassurance. In that moment, the fear that had been her constant companion receded slightly. The cabin held. They held. Her internal monologue, once consumed by fear and the ghosts of her past, began to shift. She still thought of what she had left behind, the circumstances that led her here, but the sharp edge of despair was softening. She started to notice the small things, the intricate patterns of frost on the windowpane, the way the firelight danced on the rough-hewn walls, the quiet, almost companionable ticking of a hidden insect in the wood. Silas's presence, initially an imposing unknown, had become a quiet comfort. His stoicism was not indifference, but a deep-seated resilience. She saw it in the steady way he chopped wood, the patient mending of his gear, the quiet respect he seemed to have for the unforgiving world outside. One afternoon, Silas returned from his traps with a message of a different kind. He stood just inside the door, the cold clinging to his clothes, his usual calm stillness replaced by a subtle tension. "Tracks," he said, his voice low. Alara felt an immediate clench of fear in her gut. "Wagon tracks. Not far," he didn't elaborate, didn't need to. The world outside, the one she had fled, was encroaching. Her fragile peace shattered, replaced by the familiar icy grip of terror. Were they looking for her? Had they followed? Silas watched her face, seeing the fear bloom in her eyes. He didn't offer platitudes. He simply nodded, a grim acknowledgement. Then, he went to the small chest where he kept his rifle and ammunition. The sound of the bolt clicking into place was stark and final in the quiet cabin. The outside world had found them, and for the first time Alara realized that the threat was not just to her, but to the fragile sanctuary they had built together. The air in the cabin grew thick with unspoken tension. Silas checked the rifle, cleaned it meticulously, his movements deliberate. Alara watched him, her heart pounding against her ribs. The tentative trust that had blossomed felt suddenly vulnerable. This silent, capable man had given her refuge, but would he risk himself for her? She saw the set of his jaw, the focused intensity in his eyes, and knew he was weighing the situation, calculating the risk. She felt a surge of guilt. Her presence had brought this potential danger to his doorstep. I should go," she whispered, the words tasting like ash. "Lead them away. It's better if you're not involved." Silas stopped, his gaze locking onto hers. His eyes, usually so unreadable, held a flicker of something she couldn't quite decipher. Weariness? Determination? "Go where?" he asked, his voice low, rough. "Back into the cold?" He gestured vaguely towards the window, where the snow continued its relentless descent. "They followed tracks. Going back out. Confirms you are here," he paused, considering. "And you would not last." It was a simple statement of fact, devoid of cruelty, but utterly blunt. It stripped away the pretense of noble sacrifice and laid bare her lingering fragility. He didn't tell her to stay. He simply stated the futility and danger of leaving. He turned back to the rifle, then spoke again, his voice even lower now. "They found my tracks too, likely. From when I found yours." A grim acceptance settled over him. "They will know someone is here." He didn't blame her. He simply assessed the reality. The silence returned, heavy with the unspoken understanding that they were in this together, whether they liked it or not. Days passed in a state of heightened alert. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, every distant sound sent a jolt of fear through Alara. Silas remained vigilant, spending more time watching from the windows, his rifle always within reach. He moved with a quiet readiness, his presence a steady anchor in the rising tide of her anxiety. She found herself watching him too, not just out of fear, but with a newfound admiration. He was not a man of grand gestures, but of quiet strength and unwavering resolve. Then, late one afternoon, as the light began to fade, Silas stiffened. He was standing by the window, peering out into the trees. "Riders," he murmured, his voice barely audible. Alara's breath hitched. She moved silently to stand behind him, peering over his shoulder. Through the swirling snow, she could just make out figures on horseback, moving cautiously through the woods towards the cabin. There were two of them. A cold dread settled over her. She recognized one of the horses. Silas turned from the window, his face grim. "Stay back," he said, his voice calm but firm. He moved to the door, not to open it, but to stand beside it, rifle raised. Alara retreated to the shadows near the hearth, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was it, the confrontation she had dreaded. But this time she wasn't alone. She watched Silas, his back straight, his posture radiating a quiet, formidable strength that was born of the wilderness itself. He wasn't just protecting himself. He was protecting the sanctuary he had unknowingly built with her. The riders approached the cabin slowly, stopping just outside the clearing. One dismounted, a large man, his face hard and cruel, the one who had sneered as he rode away. Alara felt a surge of cold fury, quickly followed by paralyzing fear. The man called out, his voice rough, echoing through the trees. "Silas, we know you got her in there. The girl." Silas remained silent, a statue of quiet defiance. The man yelled again, threats mixed with demands. Alara gripped her hands together, forcing herself to breathe. She looked at Silas, his focus absolute. He was ready, and something shifted within her. The shivering girl who crawled across the threshold was gone. In her place was a woman who had faced death and found a flicker of life in the most unexpected of places. She would not be the cause of this man's downfall. She would stand with him. As the man outside grew louder, more aggressive, Alara stepped out of the shadows. Silas didn't react, but she felt his awareness of her movement. She walked towards the small window, visible to the men outside, and stood there, not hiding but presenting herself. She met the hard gaze of the man outside with a steady, unwavering look. She was no longer defined by their abandonment. She was here. She was with Silas. And she would not be taken easily. The man outside faltered for a second, clearly expecting her to be huddled in terror. Silas's gaze flickered towards her, a brief moment of acknowledgement before returning to the threat. The storm outside raged, but inside, a different kind of storm had passed, leaving behind an unexpected calm, a shared resolve between two solitary souls. The man outside yelled again, but his voice seemed weaker, less certain. He had expected to find a victim. He found something else entirely. The tension stretched, taut and agonizing, as the man outside continued his verbal assault, alternating between threats and demands. Silas held his position by the door, a silent, unmoving guardian. Alara stood by the window, her gaze fixed on the men in the clearing, refusing to look away, refusing to shrink. The storm outside seemed to mirror the turmoil of the moment. Wind howling, snow swirling, reducing visibility. It was a small mercy. The second rider, who had remained mounted and silent, shifted nervously. He was younger, less hardened than the first. He glanced at the cabin, then back at the woods they had come from. The relentless cold seemed to be getting to him. The leader, sensing his partner's unease and perhaps unnerved by the silent, unyielding presence of Silas and the unexpected defiance in Alara's stance at the window, finally changed tactics. "We'll be back, Silas," the man yelled, his voice lacking its earlier conviction. "You can't hide her forever." Silas remained silent. Alara did not move from the window. The man hesitated for another long moment, his eyes scanning the cabin, the woods, searching for weakness, for a sign they could breach this quiet defense. Finding none, he finally remounted his horse. With a final, resentful glare directed at the cabin, the two men turned their horses and rode back into the blinding snow, their figures quickly swallowed by the storm. The sounds of their departure faded. Silence returned, a vast, heavy blanket punctuated only by the wind and the crackle of the fire. The immediate threat was gone, but the tension lingered, a residue in the air. Silas lowered his rifle, letting out a slow breath. He turned from the door and looked at Alara. She still stood by the window, her body stiff, her face pale but resolute. She met his gaze, and in that moment, something profound passed between them. It wasn't pity he saw or weakness. He saw the fire he hadn't expected, the steel beneath the fragility. He saw the choice she had made to stand with him to face down the threat. A flicker of something akin to respect, perhaps even understanding, crossed his face. He didn't smile, didn't offer praise. He simply nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement. But it was enough. Alara felt the tension drain away, leaving her limbs weak, but her spirit strangely calm. She had been afraid, yes, but she had not broken. She had not run. She had faced the ghosts of her past in the faces of those men, and she had not faltered. The shivering girl who stumbled out of the woods had found not just shelter, but a core of strength she hadn't known she possessed. Silas moved to the fire, adding a log, his movements returning to their usual quiet rhythm. The cabin felt different now, changed by the shared confrontation. It was no longer just his solitary refuge. It was their sanctuary, earned through silence, trust, and shared defiance. He didn't ask her if she was all right. He didn't need to. He had seen her. Alara walked away from the window and sat by the fire, holding her hands out to the warmth. The journey had been long, marked by loss and despair, abandonment and fear. But in the heart of the harsh wilderness, in the quiet presence of a solitary man, she had found not a rescuer to depend on, but a fellow traveler on the difficult road of existence. She had found her own footing. The future was uncertain. The men might return. The winter was far from over. But as she looked across the fire at Silas, who met her gaze with quiet acceptance, she knew she would face it, not with the fear of the abandoned, but with the quiet resilience of one who had found her place, not in the world that cast her out, but in the shared space forged in the crucible of hardship. This place, this quiet partnership, was not a compromise. It was an unexpected, precious form of belonging, and that was a strength no storm, no threat could ever take away.